Okay, so I'm just at the end of Kandinsky, Studying the Spiritual in Art. And there's a final section called Art and Artists, which is like 2 pages. And then the short conclusion, which is also 2 pages. And that's what's going to be here. So yeah, the invitation is to go back to, especially the ones on the colors, on blue and yellow, as well as the one just before that, when I gave the sort of the way that self-reference is present in Kandinsky's work. Like the way that this sort of quote unquote spiritual qualities of color can apply to his own expression. And this section is called Art and Artists. It's not very long. It goes, the work of art is born of the artist in a mysterious and secret way. From him it gains life and being. Nor is its existence casual, nor is its existence casual and inconsequent, but it has a definite and purposeful strength, alike in its material and spiritual life. It exists and has power to create spiritual atmosphere. And from this inner standpoint, one judges whether it is a good work of art or a bad one. From this inner standpoint. If its form is bad, it means that the form is too feeble in meaning to call forth corresponding vibrations of the soul. Look at how dated this is. He says, so-called indecent pictures are either incapable of causing vibrations of the soul, in which case they're not art, or they are so capable. In the latter case, they are not to be spurned absolutely, even though at the same time they gratify what nowadays we're pleased to call the lower bodily tastes. That's a really interesting distinction between sort of pornography in the pejorative, and what you could call still life. As in, does it resonate? Is it capable of causing vibrations in the soul? You could then get into how pornography does still cause vibrations, but not of the good kind. But anyway, that's too far afield. So as he was saying, again, this is published a while ago. He says, therefore, a picture is not necessarily well painted if it possesses the values of which the French so constantly speak. It's only well painted if its spiritual value is complete and satisfying. Quote, good drawing is drawing that cannot be altered without destruction of this inner value, quite irrespective of its correctness as anatomy, botany, or any other science. There is no question of a violation of natural form, but only of the need of the artist for such form. Similarly, colors are used not because they are true to nature, but because they are necessary to the particular picture. In fact, the artist is not only justified in using, but it is his duty to use only those forms which fulfill his own need. Absolute freedom, whether from anatomy or anything of the kind, must be given the artist in his choice of material. Such spiritual freedom is as necessary in art as it is in life. This freedom is man's weapon against the Philistines. It's based on the inner need. Note, however, that blind following of scientific precept is less blameworthy than its blind and purposeless rejection. The former produces at least an imitation of material objects, which may be of some use. Quote, plainly, an imitation of nature, if made by the hand of an artist, is not a pure reproduction. The voice of the soul will in some degree at least make itself heard. As contrasts, one may quote a landscape of Canaletto and those sadly famous heads by Denner. Anyway, he goes on. The latter, which is the blind and purposeless rejection of the following of scientific precept, is an artistic betrayal and brings confusion in its train. The former, which was at least following scientific precept, at least doing that, leaves the spiritual atmosphere empty, but the latter poisons it. Okay. Painting is an art, and art is not vague reproduction, transitory and isolated, but a power which must be directed to the improvement and refinement of the human soul, to, in fact, the raising of the spiritual triangle. Again, he talked about that much earlier. Different video. If art refrains from doing this work, a chasm remains unbridged. So he's talking about art as a way of healing the soul, as a solution to nihilism, essentially. And if it doesn't aim to that, then nihilism remains unsolved. We're stuck in our split condition. Quote, for no other power can take the place of art in this activity. And at times when the human soul is gaining greater strength, art will also grow in power, for the two are inextricably connected and complementary one to the other. Conversely, at those times when the soul tends to be choked by material disbelief, art becomes purposeless, and talk is heard that art exists for art's sake alone. This cry, art for art's sake, is really the best ideal such an age can attain to. It's an unconscious protest against materialism, against the demand that everything should have a use of, and practical value. It's further proof of the indestructibility of art and of the human soul, which can never be killed but only temporarily smothered. Then is the bond between art and the soul, as it were, drugged into unconsciousness. The artist and the spectator drift apart, till finally the latter turns his back on the former or regards him as a juggler whose skill and dexterity are worthy of applause. It's very important for the artist to gauge his position aright, to realize that he has a duty to his art and to himself, that he is not king of the cattle, so not king of the castle, but rather a servant of a nobler purpose. Again, I'm going to repeat that. He said, it's very important for the artist to gauge his position aright, to realize that he has a duty to his art and to himself, that he is not king of the castle, but rather a servant of a nobler purpose. He must search deeply into his own soul, develop and tend it, so that his art has something to clothe, and does not remain a glove without a hand. I wrote something called By Our Ever-Living Hand, which is relevant to that. Anyway, he goes on, the artist must have something to say, for mastery over form is not his goal, but rather the adapting of form to its inner meaning. Naturally, this does not mean that the artist is to instill forcibly into his work some deliberate meaning. As has been said, the generation of a work of art is a mystery. So long as artistry exists, there's no need of theory or logic to direct the painter's action. The inner voice of the soul tells him what form he needs, whether inside or outside nature. Every artist knows, who works with feeling, how suddenly the right form flashes upon him. Boecklin said that the true work of art must be like an inspiration, that actual painting or composition, etc., are not the steps by which the artist reaches self-expression. Quote, the artist is not born to a life of pleasure. He must not live idle. He has a hard work to perform, and one which often proves a cross to be borne. He must realize that his every deed, feeling, and thought are raw but sure material from which his work is to arise, that he is free in art but not in life. The artist has a triple responsibility to the non-artists. 1, he must repay the talent which he has. 2, his deeds, feelings, and thoughts, as those of every man, create a spiritual atmosphere which is either pure or poisonous. 3, these deeds and thoughts are material for his creations, which themselves exercise influence on the spiritual atmosphere. The artist is not only a king, as Peladan says, because he has great power, but also because he has great duties. If the artist be priest of beauty, nevertheless, this beauty is to be sought only according to the principle of the inner need, and can be measured only according to the size and intensity of that need. That is beautiful which is produced by the inner need, which springs from the soul. That is beautiful which is produced by the inner need, which springs from the soul. Maeterlinck, one of the first warriors, one of the first modern artists of the soul, says, quote, there's nothing on earth so curious for beauty, or so absorbent of it, as a soul. For that reason, few mortal souls withstand the leadership of a soul which gives to them beauty. And this property of the soul is the oil which facilitates the slow, scarcely visible, but irresistible movement of the triangle, the spiritual triangle, onwards and upwards. Okay, now the conclusion, which is very brief. He says, The first 5 illustrations in this book show the course of constructive effort in painting. This effort falls into 2 divisions. One, simple composition, which is regulated according to an obvious and simple form. This kind of composition I call the melodic. And 2 is complex composition, consisting of various forms, subjected more or less completely to a principal form. Probably the principal form may be hard to grasp outwardly, yeah, and for that reason possessed of a strong inner value. This kind of composition I call the symphonic. So we had simple and complex composition connected with melodic and symphonic. Between the two lie various transitional forms, in which the melodic principle predominates. The history of the development is closely parallel to that of music. If, in considering an example of melodic composition, one forgets the material aspect and probes down into the artistic reason of the whole, one finds primitive geometrical forms, or an arrangement of simple lines which help toward a common motion. This common motion is echoed by various sections, and may be varied by a single line or form. Such isolated variations serve different purposes. For instance, they may act as a sudden check, or to use a musical term, a fermata. He gives an example, which is of the Ravenna mosaic, which in the main forms a triangle. The upright figures lean proportionately to the triangle. The outstretched arm and door curtain are the fermate. I'm just going to find that. About it, he was saying, so this is it. And what he said was, yeah, that it's an example of melodic composition, which if you probe into it for the artistic reason, you find simple geometric forms or arrangements of simple lines. Yep. And it's this common motion that they're in. They help toward a common motion, and that motion is echoed by various sections and may be varied by single line or form. And the variations serve different purposes, and they're equivalent to the musical term fermata. And so he says about this, that in the main, this forms a triangle, this painting. The upright figures lean proportionately to the triangle. The outstretched arm and door curtain are the fermate. Okay, complicated. Anyway, he continues. Each form which goes to make up the composition has a simple inner value, which has in its turn a melody. For this reason, I call the composition melodic. By the agency of Cézanne and later of Hodler, this kind of composition won new life and earned the name of rhythmic. The limitations of the term rhythmic are obvious. In music and nature, each manifestation has a rhythm of its own, so also in painting. In nature, this rhythm is often not clear to us, because its purpose is not clear to us. We then speak of it as unrhythmic. So the terms rhythmic and unrhythmic are purely conventional, as also are harmony and discord, which have no actual existence. As an example of plain melodic construction with a plain rhythm, Cézanne's Bathing Women is given in this book. We already saw that. So he finishes off, complex rhythmic composition with a strong flavor of the symphonic is seen in numerous pictures and woodcuts of the past. One might mention the work of old German masters, of the Persians, of the Japanese, the Russian icons, broadsides, etc. This applies to many of Hodler's pictures. In nearly all these works, the symphonic composition is not very closely allied to the melodic. Okay, this means that fundamentally there is a composition founded on rest and balance. The mind thinks at once of choral compositions of Mozart and Beethoven. All these works have the solemn and regular architecture of a Gothic cathedral. They belong to the transition period. As examples of the new symphonic composition, in which the melodic element plays a subordinate part, and that only rarely, I've added reproductions of 4 of my own pictures. They represent three different sources of inspiration. One, a direct impression of outward nature, expressed in purely artistic form. This I call an impression. Two, a largely unconscious, spontaneous expression of inner character, the non-material nature. This I call an improvisation. And three, an expression of a slowly formed inner feeling, which comes to utterance only after long maturing. This I call a composition. In this, reason, consciousness, and purpose play an overwhelming part. But of the calculation, nothing appears, only the feeling. Which kind of construction, whether conscious or unconscious, really underlies my work? The patient reader will readily understand. Again, it's a self-reference to the text. Anyway, finally, I would remark that, in my opinion, we are fast approaching the time of reasoned and conscious composition, when the painter will be proud to declare his work constructive. This will be in contrast to the claim of the Impressionists that they could explain nothing, that their art came upon them by inspiration. We have before us the age of conscious creation. And this new spirit in painting is going hand in hand with the spirit of thought towards an epoch of great spiritual leaders. Vasily Kandinsky, concerning the spiritual in art. This edition was published in 1977. But he was born himself in 1866. So it's obviously a fair bit older than 1977. I can't quite get the publication date easily Googleable. Uh, yeah, it's sorry, originally published in 1914, which is quite fitting. All right, so I'll leave it with that. Easier to read the stuff, I think, but anyway.